So far, Right Questions has always started with a question that I've really been asked in life, with a specific memory of it. And today's question is one that I've been asked so many times that I don't even have a really solid memory about it. I just know that I get it asked the question all the time when I meet a stranger and I say that I'm Episcopalian, a professional Episcopalian at that. The question, query, inquisitive response, I'm not even sure it really counts as a question. It's more like a statement with a question mark at the end is, aren't you just a church because King Henry wanted a divorce? I've even had it said a little bit more salaciously. I do remember one time, I don't remember who or where, said, aren't you just a church because King Henry was a tramp? And my response is always, well, that is part of the story, but it is so much more complex than that. So, Dan, do you get this question?
Yeah, it's kind of an annoying question because it feels like it's a question that comes from someone who just watches the History Channel a little too much, or just has sort of a pop culture knowledge of just everything. And so when I got the question, I wonder, like, do you want an answer? Do you want to be engaged in this, or are you just trying to like deflect away from actually engaging with anything?
I think sometimes that's what's going on. I also feel like there's a piece of it that it's one of the only things that where the church comes into contact with what someone would learn in like a secular history class in like high school. And it's salacious. Like it's very soap opera-y. So if you want to hold someone to hold on to a piece of information, make it salacious.
Yeah, and it fits into that whole kind of kitsch culture that we have. You know, a gift I got at some point in teaching seminary classes from a church history class was the mug with the heads of all of Henry's wives, and when you have your hot water in it, like. And I tried that once. I thought it was like the most kind of horrifying, misogynistic gift I had ever received. Like, let's just make the women disappear.
Oh, wow. Well, I guess creativity gets some points, but
I don't think they tried it out and realized what happened.
yeah, I think that's about it. So, Dan, you and I have known each other for over a decade. You, of course, were, when we met, you were teaching at the seminary I attended, the Church Divinity School of the Pacific in Berkeley, California, but you never taught while I was there. And we just sort of crossed paths in my hanging around occasionally as an alumni. Tell our listeners more about yourself, what you're doing now. And yeah, I think that's it. Tell us about yourself and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so my name is Dan Joslyn-Siemiatkoski. I'm an Episcopal priest, and for 17 years, I taught church history at Episcopal church seminaries. First, a little bit at Episcopal Divinity School back when I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, then at Church Divinity School in Berkeley, California, and then at Seminary Southwest for the past 8 years in Austin, Texas. But now I am at Boston College, where I actually received my graduate training. And here I am directing the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. And Jewish Christian relations is really my deep passion, rooted in my knowledge of history, but also trying to amplify that out to contemporary issues.
I really am impressed with this new calling of yours, and I'm grateful on a regular basis for your reminding me of the important issues in Jewish and Christian relationships and how we in the church portray and interact with those pieces, both ancient and contemporary. So I just want to say thank you to you for that.
Well, thank you. It's I get that kind of affirmation of my vocational calling, and it's really good to receive that. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, I am the Reverend Jane Gober. I'm the rector here at Christ Church in Ridley Park, Pennsylvania, in the Diocese of Pennsylvania. And this is Right Questions. Right Questions is part of adult confirmation process. It also is for anyone who's just got some questions about what we are up to in the Episcopal Church. It's paired with the book Your Faith, Your Life by Jennifer Gamber, who's one of the guests on one of the episodes. And this episode is going to connect with chapter 3. And so, as with every single one of my episodes here, these episodes here, every single topic someone could spend entire PhDs on small segments of. But on the other hand, there's also a bigger picture that's important to know. And the chapter does a really good job of sort of walking through the sequence of historical events that lead to the church that we are today. And I'm wondering if you have 3 or 4 things, I don't even know what to call it, but things to help with the broader picture, the broader storytelling about the history of the church and how we get to the Episcopal Church as it is today.
Yeah, I really appreciate the chapter. I mean, it starts at the very beginning and talks about, the apostles. Good job.
Good place to start.
Yeah. And, it really gets us up right, to the past decade of the life of the Episcopal Church. It does all in 10 pages. So, like, well done. I think it does a great job. And so there's so many things to say about history of Christianity in general, history of the Episcopal Church. When I was in seminary last teaching, this was all done over 3 semesters. So we're not going to be able to do that here.
No.
So I think instead of like picking out like specific episodes, I want to talk about like 3 ways that I encourage people to think about history,
All right.
especially people who are Christian or who are trying to be clergy or who want to have a deeper way of engaging with how the church meets the world, which I think is always kind of the go-to question at the end of the day when you come to history is, so what? Like, so what that this happened? Why should we care? This doesn't feel connected to me, or what have you. So the first thing I often lead with is helping people to think about history as story in context. That is, so Winston Churchill once said, the problem with history is it's one damn thing after another. Right. And so we have this way of thinking about history, which is just like this slog through time, and this thing happened, and that thing happened. And it's all about dates, facts, figures, the great men of history. And you have to know time periods. You have to know who major actors were. You have to know events. But it's really asking, what is the context in which things are happening? That is, there's one way of thinking about history, which is just a sequence of events. But I think it's better to think of history as interconnected events, that they layer, and that things aren't inevitable, but that things happen for complex sets of reasons. So I always tell my students, if someone tells you, X event happened for Y reason, that they say is a complex event, like say the Great Depression or the American Revolution, or the separation of the Church of England from the Church of Rome happened because of one thing, like King Henry's divorce. I tell them, don't trust people who give you simple answers for complex events. Complex events happen for complex reasons. So if we're going to go into the reasons why Henry separates the Church of England from the Church of Rome, we could talk about English royal papal relations. We could talk about reform movements. We could talk about debates over God-given authority between monarchs and church leaders that are all happening in the centuries prior to this. And then, so that we actually get into some very interesting spaces, and we get into questions like, who wanted this? Who cared about it? Who participated in it? So I would argue context is everything. I think this matters when I was talking to people who are trained to be clergy, to help them see that thinking about context historically is a really good transferable skill for thinking about context for ministry. That, and I'm sure, Jane, you have many stories about you or others barreling into a ministry context, not thinking about that context, or thinking there's a very simple reason why X thing is happening when there's actually a very complex web of things.
A dozen factors that I may or may not know about and ever be even told about, and there may not even be any evidence about, but all those layers of story impact every reaction in the moment.
Right, exactly. And I think this works for people in so many fields. I just got to a new job here at Boston College. I've decided I'm just going to talk to people for a while before I come up with any big new plans.
Mm-hmm.
I've lived all over the country. You have too. I think you were a military brat.
I am.
So I think you also have that, different places have different narratives, and it takes a while to pick up on those narratives.
Yeah.
And so history is just full of overlapping and intersecting narratives. So very rich tapestries. And so that's the first thing. Instead of thinking of history as just one thing after another, think of them as these kind of beautiful interlocking webs, quilt works, wherever the fractals, wherever like metaphor you want there, I think helps you kind of enjoy, be curious, want to dig into one area. I think it's just a useful way to approach history.
It really is. And one of the things that came up, in the sequence of events in the book and, is that place where the Christian religion goes from being outlawed and persecuted at different levels, but not always the same, to being one of the legalized religions, to being basically the way I talk about it when I teach history is basically it became a merger eventually.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But the reasons for that are extraordinarily complex from whether it's environmental factors, factors of literacy, breakdown, tribal movements, the complexity of that story, of the context of what's going on that leads to it. And then it's also not as plain and simple as, you know, Mr. So and so writes a document and suddenly everything is all better.
Right, right. Yeah, like Martin Luther posting the 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg, which, by the way, probably never actually happened. But like we have a narrative about that. Like Martin Luther posts those 95 Theses, and everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, can you believe it?" And like the world is upside down.
Everything changes and half of the world reforms and
Yeah,
what have you, whereas it's so complex.
much more complex. And there was many moments where everything could have stopped or been averted, or for years after that, a good 3 years after that event, Martin Luther's saying, if the Pope would just like sit down,
Listen to me.
like let's have a conversation. Now, of course, anyone having a reasonable conversation with Martin Luther could be challenging because he was a very irascible sort of fellow, and eventually they banned him from going to dialogues. But it just gives you that sense of what historians call contingency,
Okay.
right? Like there's never singular events, or there's rarely singular events. But even those singular events all have these complex lead ups to them.
Contingency is an important word to think about. Thank you for that.
Yeah, contingency is one of the ones I really try to get folks to lean into. So a second kind of way I encourage people to think about history, especially the history of Christianity, is to think of the history of Christianity as always global.
Okay.
We tend to think of global Christianity as an offshoot of the missionary movement of the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yep.
We have this way of thinking about the history of Christianity that it starts in land of Israel, Eastern Mediterranean. They go up to Antioch. They go west across to Rome, north into Europe, the rest of Europe, over to the British Isles, across the Atlantic. And then, thank God they found America, because then they could go everywhere and send missionaries everywhere.
It's definitely a westward leaning telling of history.
Yeah, it's kind of a manifest destiny, almost kind of,
It is.
westward expansion model of it. So one of the things I do with teaching history of Christianity is try to show how it's from the beginning multilingual.
Mm-hmm.
Just think about what happens in Acts chapter 8, where Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, right?
Yeah.
What's going on there? Like Philip's riding on the road, and he finds this Ethiopian eunuch, and he gets baptized, and then he goes to Ethiopia and spreads the gospel. And then we hear zip about it. But, sometime in the decade of the 30s of the Common Era, there's Christians in Ethiopia, right? We have early communities of Christians all the way over to India.
Every trade route, really.
There's trade routes. Like if you just look at a map of East Africa, you could just see how you could just hug the coast all the way over to India. The first Christian kingdom is in Armenia. We have Christianity in Nubia by the 4th century. where the kingdom of Nubia becomes Christian, and we have really interesting archaeological evidence of that. We have Christianity in China by the 6th century. Turns out that Christianity is in Tibet before Buddhism is in Tibet,
Wow, I had no idea.
right? Moving along the Silk and Spice roads.
Yeah, it makes sense,
Right.
but
Yeah. Buddhism was a missionary religion also. So think of China and Buddhism as like equivalent.
yeah.
Buddhism is coming out of the South Asian region of what we call India today. We have, little carvings of Christ on the cross or nativity scenes in ivory from Northern Europe, areas like Germany. Now you have to think, where's the ivory coming from? What's coming
Yeah.
from Africa? There's
Yeah.
trade routes. The first form of Christianity in Western Sub-Saharan Africa is Catholicism in the 15th century, brought by the Portuguese.
Interesting.
There's a Congolese cardinal at the Council of Trent in the 1540s. So if we begin to think of Christianity as global from very early on, multi-ethnic, multilingual, that helps it to center part of the Eurocentric whiteness narrative that we're all sort of been struggling with lately about how we recast our story. The chapter that you all been reading for this podcast does a good job of that when it comes to the Episcopal Church, but we can actually do the work much earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about having people re-narrate the history of Christianity. So what does it look like when we say, well, the history of Christianity is a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multiracial narrative from its origins? That just shifts how we view ourselves as inheritors of it. So if we think of the community of saints, the people who have gone before us, and we think about where they're located, we can begin with a global vision of it that's authentic.
Terrific. It's important to dig deep into that place where it's always been a part of who we are. And in some ways, we've been influenced by 2,000 years of Western Christian art, primarily of what's flowing into us. But you're naming, for me, for the first time, this place of these ivory creches in Germany is an astounding reminder of how the world's actually always, well, a number of the continents at least, have been always highly connected. We just sort of lost that information along the way when we started painting with such broad brushes about history.
Yeah, I think part of it is just to ask the question of how do we get our narratives? Where do our stories come from? And if we're located in the United States, it's coming out of Eurocentric perspectives that are informed by a kind of colonialism. There's this, I forget where I read this story. I think it's just probably an internet meme, actually, so I'm just going to repeat it. But it's more of a illuminating thing where it's a story, and it mirrors some things that happened with missionary activity in the 19th century. Missionary comes to a Palestinian Christian village. The missionary says, do you know the gospel? And the young man he's talking to says, yes, we know the gospel. We know who Jesus is. Now, the missionary is suspicious if he really knows the real gospel and not some Catholic version, maybe that's all, polluted by rituals and rites and ceremonies, and that's just the true word of
Our
God.
bias towards our neighbor.
Right. And so the missionary asks, well, where'd you get your gospel from? And the young man says, hold on, I'll find out. And so he goes and asks the village elder, where did our gospel come from? And he talks to the village elder, and he comes back from the village elder and says to the missionary, he says from Paul. Right? So the sense of the Eurocentric narrative of, we have the gospel and we're going to bring it to other people. Instead of not having this picture of the apostles and this apostolic legacy. And it calls for a little bit of cultural humility for us to come to new contexts and locations and say, who's been here before? Or when we receive people from churches globally into the United States, who come as Christians to listen to their story of Christianity as they come into our communities. I just came out of the Diocese of Texas most recently, where there's a large Dinka community from South Sudan that comes through Anglican missionary activity in the 19th century, but they call on the legacy of ancient Christian African kingdoms as part of their missionary work and part of their own narrative that this has been a Christian land for some time. And it's important to listen to those legacies and those stories.
Thank you for that reminder.
Yeah, it's helpful, I think.
So, do you have a third way to help us think about history?
Yeah, I often get this question. So, what do the average person think? I'll be talking
Like the average person in history?
in history, right?
Okay.
So, what did the average person, I'm talking about, I don't know, the Council of Nicaea. Well, what did the ordinary person think? Or a massive question often as I'm working through the early history of Christianity is, where are all the women? Like, you read the New Testament and it's clear that like women are like the drivers of the gospel,
Right.
right? And so like, where are their voices? And so it's a question of elite versus popular visions of Christianity. Many of the sources we have that are written come out of elite contexts.
Right.
Even today, the media we consume, even though social media is its own work, it's mediated through all these filters of the global elite, whether it's a Mark Zuckerberg or where we're
Or an influencer or
doing, right,
yeah.
yeah. So I always try to help people see that the average person is engaged, is talking, and the question is, how can we uncover their voices? So one great way is through what we call material culture, which is just talking about ivories, right? Like, what's left behind when we do archaeological digs? Can we find houses that have Christian artifacts in them? So there's been some great research done in Egypt in the 4th century that shows all kinds of ways that people transitioned from Egyptian magic to Christian magic.
Mm-hmm.
So amulets, right?
Yep.
An amulet, something you wear around your neck that often has there's some kind of container that holds something wrapped up in papyrus or something else that has invocations to a god for X, Y, and Z. And so scholars have discovered papyrus with Christian invocations to protect people. So invoking various saints, invoking Christ, invoking the Virgin Mary to protect them for health, welfare, safety of children, for travelers. And so one of the interesting things to think about in this perspective is religion was true if your God was powerful to act.
Mm-hmm.
So an amulet isn't just like superstition. It's trusting that the God you believe in will protect you.
Yeah.
So one of the things to just think about is the crosses we wear around our necks are essentially amulets
Yeah.
designed to replace non-Christian symbols of divine protection. And actually, St. John Chrysostom has several sermons on the wearing of crosses, where
Mm-hmm.
he's basically trying to get Christians to wear crosses around their neck instead of amulets they could buy from other people.
It part of what you're pointing to is that place where the common spirituality and the common engagement with religion is less categorized than maybe the top-down approach is. I was reading an article about how younger Western folks have a more open-ended spirituality and more experimentation with
Mm.
this, that, and the other, and so on. And I actually think people have been doing that all along. We just haven't made note of it because of where the sources are and so
Mhm.
on. So that there are ways in which, localized ancient indigenous practices in almost every place where the church lands get some of their practices transformed into something else.
Right.
that matches. And that has just been the way of the world for basically forever.
Hmm.
And we have a duty to do that with, well, at least I have a duty to do that with discernment and care and so on, and really think through it and make sure I'm not just borrowing something because I'm Martha Stewart of religion and think, oh, that's cool. But honoring the fact that it's not coming from a place of deception or unfaith. It's coming from a embodied faith.
Exactly. Exactly. And a sense of like, there's something here that's really true. So, like, one of the great examples of how popular religion begins to influence official religion in Christianity is
Hmm.
around the dispute about what to call the Virgin Mary in 5th
Okay.
century Constantinople. So some folks might have heard that if you come from like the Orthodox world, Mary was referred to as Theotokos, which means the God bearer.
Yep.
And some theologians got upset about that. They said, well, she shouldn't be called the God bearer because that would be referring to like giving birth to God the Father. She should be called Christotokos, Christ bearer, or Anthropotokos, the bearer of
Humanity.
humanity. And this controversy, basically people are singing hymns in church to the Theotokos. And the bishop of Constantinople, Nestorius, gets up and preaches a sermon against this. And this kicks off the controversy called the Nestorian controversy that leads to a famous definition of who Jesus Christ is that's called the Chalcedonian formula or Chalcedonian agreement. And Jane's nodding her head because Jane has learned this well from her teachers.
I
Uh,
have.
you have, but and we don't need to get into the weeds of what the doctrine was, but the doctrine comes out of a dispute about lived religion.
Yeah.
And just to see that we can, if we read against the grain of history, we can find the voices of everyday people, or what we call social history, or history from below, bubbling up. And I think we live that all the time. I think what we're living through the pandemic and post-pandemic, or whatever we're in, that I know you're trying to navigate, which is how do we live our spiritual lives through these mediated forms of internet, Zoom, video? Can the Eucharist be consecrated online? All these questions, which really have profound, deep implications, are arising of people's lived experience.
Yeah. One of the ways in which, trying to use these digital formats is trying to answer is the context in which we have people's lives that are pressed upon for duties and actions 24/7, 7 days a week, with the pressure of your kids won't, survive and thrive unless they do 9 million activities and unless you're doing 9 million activities, which pushes out the space for one gathered time for spiritual nurture, but people still have that need.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I would just argue that sort of give and take is always happening in the history of the church. You just need to have the right sets of lenses to observe it
Yeah.
and be asking the right sorts of questions about like, why is this thing happening, and whose voices can we listen to that we haven't been listening to before in various moments in time.
Yeah. Interestingly, I want to get your take on this. So, my answer to the question about Henry VIII relates to this, of that if he had been the only person in the entire kingdom that thought this was a good idea, he could have done it, but he would have been slaughtered. In
Mhm.
some ways, he was riding one of the waves of local and human religion through the mercantile class and the knowledge that was coming in and increased literacy. He was taking he like I said, he was riding the wave of a reality within his kingdom. Now, was it 100%? No. But was it significant? Yes. And to his political advantage.
Right, right. And we hate to think that the political and the spiritual is intertwined.
We've been well trained in the idea that they are not supposed to.
Right. But like it's unavoidable. Like, and I would just simply say there is no human society in which the political and the spiritual is not intertwined.
Absolutely.
And proceed with caution.
Exactly. careful discernment in community,
Yeah.
check your sources, etc.
Yeah.
So, speaking of action in life,
Hmm.
you've been a church history professor for a long while now. You have advanced degrees. You are a priest. What's something that we can do?
One is a little habit I have, and the other is kind of a framework. So my my habit that maybe you might want to try out is stop and read the plaque.
What do you mean by stop and read the plaque?
And read the historical marker. So
Ah,
you're walking
okay.
down the road and you see those little historical markers,
Hmm.
just stop and read it. Because what it's doing is it's telling you a story about that place.
Hmm.
I think one of the things that we do as modern people is forget that places are their own vibrant realities. It's not just a building. Like, if we think about the community of saints, that we have this long history of people and time and place,
Hmm.
every place in a way is kind of vibrating with the past.
Yeah.
If you just stop and think about it. So just always stop and read the plaque. This drives my kids crazy because my wife and I like just always do this. And sometimes the plaque is long. So we used to drive up to the Twin Cities from Austin. It's along Interstate 35. It's where my wife's family lived. And we would stop at rest stops like in Nebraska. And there's this huge, like, you know,
Plaque.
three plaques. I'm
Yeah.
like, why are we here reading this in the cold? I'm like, this is really interesting. It's telling us this, stop and read the plaques because that will just center you a little bit more in where
Hmm.
you are. So, which is kind of the framework, the second bit, the framework I would encourage, which is to be curious about where you are.
Okay.
Just be curious about where you are. Like, ask yourself, why does this road go this way? One of the things I found out when I was living in Austin is that there were certain roads, and was something called Shoal Creek, which is a stream bed that runs through the center of Austin. Turns out that was essentially the Native American highway.
Ah,
That was how people got places as they walked along this dry
it's
stream bed.
moderately cleared out through the floods of rains of an arroyo effect. Yeah.
Exactly. And it was all limestone. So it was pretty well smoothed out, right? So, and then you realize, oh, like these major roads, well, that was the road to Houston. That was the road to San Antonio. That was the road to Dallas. And those roads often were earlier indigenous pathways. And so you just ask yourself, like, why does this road go here? Or what was here before this building was here?
Yeah.
So if you're a church, just one of the things, again, in a parish, if you're new to a church, is to just look around at the windows and the other markers inside the sanctuary and just like notice the names
Hmm.
or the pictures of all the rectors.
Hmm.
Notice what you can about those pictures. And I always would tell folks who are trying to be clergy, when you get to your parish, talk to the people who've been there the longest, get to know them. But I would say foster a habit of curiosity about where you are.
Those are great pieces of advice for every part of life. So, today, your three ways to think about history were to think of it as story in context, that there are layers of interconnected events always going on. It isn't just a single thing that happened randomly, usually.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, that Christian history has always been global and always been complex. Complex in gender, complex in race, complex in ethnicity and location. And that thinking about it that way helps us to decenter some of the ways in which the story has been told from a elite Western perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And then thirdly is uncovering the ordinary, that there beyond the text there is a bit of a mystery, but it still has evidence of it, of the ordinary spirituality of the lives of the faithful through time. And sometimes that's just going to come up through material evidence. Sometimes it's going to come up through buildings, like what we were just talking about at the end. And at the end, you had two suggestions. Number one is to read the plaque, take the time, read the plaque. And then, secondly, just being curious about where you are and why things are the way they are, whether it's in a building or in a neighborhood or in a relationship, even.
Hmm. Hmm. Exactly.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining me in this experiment in Right Questions and giving us some healthy ways to think about church history that are more than just this, that, and the other detail and historical moment. And I will actually say that we are recording this on a day of a historical moment of the death of Queen Elizabeth II. May she rest in peace and rise in glory. But to close us out, I am going to offer a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer. And this is actually one for a church convention or meeting, and I'm adapting it a little bit, but I think it connects well to thinking about church history. So let us pray. Almighty and ever living God, source of all wisdom and understanding, be present with those who strive for the renewal and mission of your church in every age. Teach us in all things to seek first your honor and glory. Guide us to perceive what is right, help us to be curious, and grant us both the courage to pursue it, and the grace to accomplish it. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.